First of all, it is such an honor to follow Omowale Clay. I mean, really.
She and I go back a while.
Right, that's true. Really, comrades and friends, this is a walking people's historian, along with a frontline activist in the revolutionary struggle. So we've seen so many times, really, in the streets of New York, along with Zimbabwe, which you described so well. I want to pick up on this point about it being a moment in time and seeing the global struggle in this way. We're at a certain moment in time where things are getting really unstable here in the center of the empire, and you can just see and feel the decay and the rot, and know that it's also a system becoming more ruthless than at any time in the past. And it's coming home here. There was an article I just read in The Economist before coming here. That's a real capitalist tool. Described one subway line, the L line in Chicago, where life expectancy differs by 30 years. From the prosperous, largely white North Chicago, Streeterville, life expectancy is 90. Same subway line to the poorest, largely black neighborhoods of Chicago's South Side, Englewood, where average life expectancy is 30 years. That means it's 60 years, 30 years lower. That's lower than Bangladesh or India or Yemen at war. So that's the empire coming home. In LA, there was just figures released, 44,000 homeless people who live on the streets. Now New York City, they said there's 133,000 who are in homeless shelters, and that New York is no longer really trying to get a count of the thousands who refuse to live in the dangerous shelters. Although 1 in 10 students in the public schools have no address. So these are the figures here in the U.S. The lack of affordable housing and the countless number of families that double up. And the homeless rate is growing, it said in 10 years' time, the last 10 years, by 142%, 10 years. There's only 1.2 million people who live in public housing. And then Section 8 vouchers that cover about another 1.4 million. There's no public housing that's been built in the U.S. in the last 10 years, not in the last 20 years. And I raise that, I mean, we all talk about wages declining, the unprotected gig workers, that's the only job growth, the educational standards going down, the only industrialized country without a national health plan. So, and no matter what the Democratic Party debates, they could have 10 people on stage. This isn't really changing. And I raise this because a lot can happen in 10 years. Now let's look, we just came back from China. So it depends on where you live on the planet. China has announced that they have eliminated poverty in the last 10 years in China. They say 2020 because they're still isolated and underdeveloped pockets that they feel, rural areas that they still haven't completely raised up. In the last 40 years, it's 800 million people lifted out of poverty. It's off the scale with any of the UN expectations. Poverty is actually unknown in the cities of China, in the urban centers. And it makes it an amazing place to visit. So the focus now is on the rural and the isolated and the less developed areas. The goal is a moderately prosperous, that's a term they use, moderately prosperous society for all. So we've seen there's no public housing being built here at all. China is building millions of units a year more than 5 million units some years. There's other years where they exceeded 10 million housing units built. So it is a moment in time, how far it's come. And we were there celebrating. We went for the celebration, Michael and I. It was just like a personal trip, but we wanted to see what China was like on the 70th anniversary. And there was a tour that was announced. We were the only people who signed up for it. It was publicized all over. So I said, okay, they would go ahead with it. So it was a very interesting time in all kinds of levels and ways. But just compare 70 years. 1949, China, 90% impoverished, illiterate, no security, overwhelming majority, landless peasants. Famines that decimated whole provinces, constant wars, marauding gangs. And today, less than 1% in the most isolated areas are poor. And this was done through socialist planning. Planning of public consumption and public services and industrial development, massive jobs programs, a lot of foreign investments too. It's a struggle to extract Western technology. They had a lock on it, and they do sanction, and China was absolutely sanctioned until 1979. They made a certain deal with the West, yes, they did, because until that time, they couldn't get a hairpin. So they made certain concessions, and a lot of industries swept in really cheap wages. So it was a struggle to get technology, to get development. There was a lot of state planning, too, in these developing industries, and urban subsidies. They did a lot also. They were doing a lot on the introduction of rural pensions. How about the people left behind in the countryside? And they're getting older. They have a right to a full pension. That's a big thing. Raising the skill levels and the educational levels. But what does all this feel like if you're visiting? I want to say you kind of think you're almost dropped on another planet. It's shocking and it's exciting. It's almost disorienting. Imagine a city where you do not see anyone panhandling or camped out on sidewalks or on heat grates or just desperate and in need, and know that there's no services. To see cities where you know no one is hungry or needy. Now, we were only there 2 weeks. We saw 3 major cities. Shanghai and Beijing are each 3 times the size of New York City. And from what we saw of these cities, they're modern beyond belief. They have some amazing architecture. I think you've seen some of these incredible pictures, but very livable. And there's housing construction everywhere. And modern units that all have balconies and big windows. That's the new housing that's going up. Earlier times, you can almost see it by decade, what the designs are from the 1-story to the 4- and 5-story and, you know, more modern and to what's going up today. And apparently the high-rises are what's really popular with the young. And when they have a chance to choose, that's where they want to be. And older folks want to stay where they are. In very, very livable cities, because every lane, is so incredibly clean and well-kept, and neighborhood associations. It's pretty incredible, too. This housing construction, as I say, it's everywhere. But the thing that I think we couldn't stop talking about, Michael and I, was the subways. You really can't. I mean, if you live in New York, you can't get over the subways. There's 22 new lines in Beijing and 16 new lines in Shanghai in the last 15 years, and they are spectacular, bright, well-lit, easy to navigate. All the signs are in Chinese and in English. I mean, we had no trouble literally getting around. It's much easier than getting around the New York City subway. I will tell you that. Connecting lines, every subway with escalators and elevators, every single station with clean public bathrooms. I mean, and when you come upstairs, there's like bike share options and more than 11,000 electric buses in Beijing. So the city is actually quieter than you think of in urban congested places. There are a lot of national campaigns to improve air quality, which had gotten really bad. Pollution was a real problem in these dense cities, and now it's a huge campaign for clean air, big tree planting programs, a lot of public squares and all these flower beds and benches, all kinds of, the whole city, Beijing, but also Shanghai, Nanjing, were just awash in red flags. Every single building, smallest to the biggest, had big, the red Chinese People's Republic of China flags. So we traveled from one end of the city to the other. We mainly took the subways and the buses, and we walked. We also took the bullet high-speed trains, and that's pretty amazing, too, because you see a lot of the countryside, and you just see building everywhere. I mean, you see forests of cranes and new housing that's going up, and then whole areas where every possible tree planting and whatnot is going on. The most amazing thing, again, this is like looking at things as a New Yorker, you can't really go 2 blocks in any of these cities without clean public bathrooms, not just in the subways, like on the streets, all over the city. Neighborhoods, narrow lanes of old housing to big public squares. It's the downtown, but it's the outer areas too. They're all staffed. There were huge crowds. I mean, these are big cities, 20 million people. You know, it's not hard. It's not spacious. And these are older cities. They're certainly mega cities, but it was very orderly. People are extremely well dressed. So you're actually seeing cities where homelessness is really unknown. And it is an all-out effort to make the cities both inclusive and sustainable and use new levels of urban planning. They take urban planning really seriously. I mean, they see it as a science. They have a museum of urban planning, and they're architects you don't design a building. No, you design a whole neighborhood, and it has central heating and central electric and, high tech on every level. Now, there's a lot of criticism by Western capitalists. You can't hardly see an article on China where they won't tell you that there's too much housing being built, that there's a big glut, and that there's ghost housing, and that there's millions of empty units. There probably are. Now, because in China, development is happening unlike anywhere else. Most of the world's mega cities throughout the developing world, I'm talking about Indonesia and Cairo, Egypt, and Beirut, and Lagos, Nigeria, and Mexico City, and Sao Paulo, and Pakistan, and India, and Bangladesh, globally. The big corporate investors, they'll build industries, and then millions of people, desperate, landless peasants, flood into the cities. But there's nothing built for them. There's nothing built for them. And this is what gives rise to really whether it's called slums or favelas or barrios, there's no sanitation built, there's no sewers, there's not really electrification. People are forced to build really with tin and scraps and as best they can to put together some kind of housing. It gets washed away in the rains. Now, China's view is that you got to build the housing first. Lots of different kinds of housing and models of housing, high rises to lower units, and put in the drains and the sewage and the electrification and the subway lines and build the schools and even put in where the bakeries and the parks and the gyms are going to be and build them, not just plan them hypothetically sometime in the future. You got to build them first, and then you build the industries and then invite people in. So it is really a plan, more and more also for the rural populations. China plans by 2030 to be 70% urban. But that is, and they're now about 60% percent urban. So that is really their plan on what are called second and third tier cities. And it's even more planned than the mega cities that we saw. So it's a very interesting kind of development, but it is also development that is impossible to even conceptualize under capitalism, where everything is the mega profits of the minute. Now, there are lots of U.S. capitalist corporations and Swedish and French and British in China. And you can go to these big shopping malls and you're going to see Starbucks and Nike and Apple and H&M and Zara and whatnot. Every brand name has flagship stores in the malls, and most of these goods are probably made in China. And there are lots of Chinese products, too. There is a high level of prosperity. I want to say it's not yet, nor does China claim it is, equality. There are Chinese billionaires, that's true, and millionaires. And there is a real feeling in China that this is helpful for dealing with the West, that these operate as kind of go-betweens. There are lots of Chinese petty capitalists, and small merchants and little shops and bakeries and cafes and clothing and artisan shops, lots of that. And the way in which it's described in China is we're building towards socialism. This is not yet socialism. And that's a pretty honest evaluation, actually. Oh, okay. So the big focus is on raising the level of development. It's called socialism with Chinese characteristics. It's facing economic reality. It's not yet socialism, and also it is the developing country where there is a history of enormous social inequality. And so at this stage, it's raising the minimum level for all. There's more graduates in what are called the STEM studies, that's science, technology, engineering, and math in China, than the whole rest of the world combined. So they are planning development in a very aggressive way. And so let me just get to visiting during the 70th anniversary. I know I got to roll through. This was a communist victory, and they make no bones about it. This is when Mao said China has stood up. And it is, you know, we're so used to patriotism in the U.S. is so ugly. We're so repelled by just the chauvinism, the racism, the white supremacy, the war mania that always comes with flag waving. I mean, there's no one here that can see someone waving a flag without going, you know, or go into a fight stance. I mean, really. And it's so different if you're in a country that's formerly colonized and underdeveloped and is building for a future. Their patriotism is so part of national pride, and it's also defensive. We're not going to allow imperialism back in. So that's what the October 1st celebration was really all about. They had this huge military parade. They brought out some weapons it seems the U.S. didn't even know they had and has had long discussions about now. But they brought out drones and mini subs and missile things, and it was a statement of sovereignty. It really is. I mean, China hasn't attacked any country. The U.S. has 800 bases around the world and aircraft carriers right off the coast, and so, but they want to send a message with the parade. That was just the shortest part of the parade. Then comes this civilian part that went on for a couple of hours, where there's units of just thousands of people. It's led off by a unit celebrating Mao and the road forward, all in red, the thousands of people. That was sort of interesting. And they said that was a departure, that there is a revival and a looking again to Mao. There were also units praising, and so it praising the economic changes and Deng Xiaoping, and it's sort of how they put their history together. It's always important to understand how people in another country see their history, and a lot of this was framed in how to always assert that it's a role of the party and that the party had stayed united through all of this. And that is where China didn't break and the Soviet Union collapsed. and that is they simply let go of the party, and then in came capitalist restoration. So the message is part of this whole 70th anniversary was in every way, every message, every billboard was also a salute to the Chinese Communist Party. And the Chinese Communist youth were sort of everywhere also, and visiting historic sites and also as volunteers. So that was their message, that they've gone through big struggles in the past, but they've held together, and so on. Now, this is also said in the face of now trade war and the new sanctions. We had just arrived when a whole new set of, there hadn't been sanctions on China since 1979, and suddenly they sanctioned Costco with 1,000 freighters and 100 super tankers were declared under sanctions. And the demand in the trade war, and as part of the sanctions, is that China stop subsidizing the state-owned industries and stop what's called technology transfers. This technology transfers is if the U.S. or any corporation sets up a factory in China, then Chinese specialists have to be trained to run it, and that the ownership and the blueprints and the spare parts reverts to China after 15 to 20 years, depending on what the contract is. Now, the U.S. doesn't want to be bound by any contract like that. Imagine if GM workers right here on strike had an agreement like this where they said this plant can't be moved to Mexico for cheaper wages. It belongs to us. No, they won't allow it here. But they have gained that in China, and that's an important accomplishment. Now, I'm glad Omawale described so much both how the sanctions impact in Zimbabwe, because really we need a national and an international campaign on this very issue, and countries around the world are demanding it of the movement here in the U.S. So we got to really step up on this. Sanctions are economic terrorism. It's a most deadly weapon, and it's a completely neutral sound. They just announce it here, and no one goes, ugh. We have to make it equal if someone said we're using napalm tomorrow, because sanctions hit right into the center of every city, and they especially do hit, it's true, the urban areas, but it is targeting developing countries, and it is like a nuclear bomb going off in a country. It's intended to create mass inflation and huge unemployment. It's intended to create hyperinflation, to make the currency overnight just worthless. And we saw that in Venezuela. We came back from Iraq also with bundles of currency because we could actually give it away to everyone who we wanted to get. $1,000 bills to show how worthless the currency became. That was sanctions. That was sanctions. It's an effort to shut down a targeted government's ability to make any plans and to bankrupt the government, to destroy the development plans, and it is also consciously to give rise to pirates and privateers and those who know how to work the market and gain a little bit, because that creates divisions within society. Who's got it? Who doesn't? It creates divisions even within the parties, the political organizations. That's its intention. There's a targeting of essential medicines. 80% of the medicines in Venezuela, suddenly you couldn't get, literally from antibiotics to malaria drugs to insulin. It's sanctions on seeds and pesticides and fertilizer and chlorine for water purification. And you can't, a country who had only developed raw materials can't even export them anymore. They have no markets. So it's really not a neutral thing. And we got to explain this in ways, really unpack it here. There's more than 30 countries that are sanctioned, and just to say Iran and Syria and Zimbabwe and Venezuela and Cuba, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Sudan, Russia, now China too. Can all this be enforced? Well, maybe not. Maybe they'll start trading with each other. But it won't be so easy because the development and the infrastructure are still here. So it's not that there's no solution to this in the long run. But for right now, it is meant to strangle every possible country and distort trade and put more power back in the hands of the imperialists who fear they're going down. That's what's in their head. So let me just close. I'm not going to touch on Syria. Folks had asked me to, except to say there the sanctions go back to 2003. And the aim, even at that time, this was before the U.S. war and the bombing and the, quote, civil war began, 100,000 mercenaries that were attempting to pull Syria apart. But it was how to first destabilize the economy and create all kinds of shortages and frustration inside. When the U.S. imposes sanctions, they know they can get all the NATO countries and the entire British Commonwealth. We certainly saw that in Zimbabwe, when the British Commonwealth declares sanctions and the U.S. goes along with it, and then NATO goes along with it. So these imperialists back each other up. We do need an international campaign, and in the coming months, there are really plans to both build an event here in New York, to build also international days, and we want to do a lot more consulting and in terms of really developing this here and everywhere. There's a lot of organizations who are very interested in it. It's been a focus of our work over years on Iraq. We were the one organization that really brought alive what the sanctions did there, but we need to explain this because these are the issues that unite the ruling class here, both political parties. And if you don't believe it, just look at any vote on the military budget. They will disagree with each other on everything, but on the military budget, it all comes together. Now, there was an important vote today on actually withdrawing U.S. invasion troops from northern Syria. This was supposedly a rebuke to Trump, right? But the question was withdrawing U.S. troops. House Democrats voted 225 to 0. It says a lot, doesn't it? Every single one. To not withdraw the troops, condemning withdrawing U.S. troops. Every single Democrat in the House, including the ones who are supposedly progressive, they voted against ending this illegal occupation. The Republicans, it was 129 to 60, so there were some Trump loyalists there, but for the most part, even there. So it just shows, you know, 129 for against. Right, withdrawing the troops. So even there, it was quite a rebuke. Now this follows. That was today's vote. Tuesday, they voted legislation to support democracy in Hong Kong. It was such an overwhelming vote, they didn't even bother to do a hand raising. It was just by acclamation, and it's a whole series of new sanctions, which, as China says, well, actually, you're going to hurt the capitalists in Hong Kong much more with this. But we'll let them figure that out. But this is on respect for human rights and democracy in Hong Kong, which is a completely fraudulent issue. So these are the votes that really unite the ruling class here. When it comes to attacking any country around the world, they will come together. And we got to forge a real unity here among the people here when any country is attacked anywhere in the world, and especially with the sanctions. We got to really form a force that, you know, that says, no, this you're not going to do. And that's the kind of unity we have to build in the movement here and link up with struggles and countries around the world. Thank you. Such great questions here. Let me just try to answer a few. I think Omowale addressed a lot about the Belt and Road. I could talk about it in other places, but what Cosmia asked about, see, there's 350,000 Chinese students now in the U.S., but the ones you hear from, and there's a reason for it, are several thousand students who are here from Hong Kong. They have their own student organizations that are separate and apart from the Chinese student organizations. And it has its own agenda. But there was a demonstration called on Sunday under the theme of Free Hong Kong by HK for NY, Hong Kong Student Organization. And we decided to go check it out. We thought, well, maybe we would meet some pro-China students there because when the Hong Kong group had demonstrated in the past, particularly in Chinatown here in New York and in other places, Chinese students came out to try to shut it down. So we thought, well, maybe we'll meet, maybe that'll happen again. Now, I got there about an hour, a little bit more beforehand, and it was quite an amazing experience because there were these boxes, brand new boxes, that were delivered on site, and it was like seeing a demonstration in a box. Every one of us here know what it takes to put together a demonstration. But here were these students opening boxes almost like it was, I don't know, Christmas Day or something or other, holiday. And inside were brand new flags and little telescoping flag poles, and then gas masks and face masks and yellow helmets and yellow umbrellas and the yellow vests, all the symbols of Hong Kong. And then out came all the U.S. flags. These were all there in the box, and then the pop-up stage. And then there was like a small orchestra that was delivered, including music stands and chairs, brand new, nice equipment. So I was pretty impressed. I was just sort of like sitting there in the midst of this, having my cup of coffee. See, I raise it because there's a lot of behind-the-scenes help. Who knows where it's coming from? A lot of behind-the-scenes help of this Free Hong Kong movement, just as there is in Hong Kong. When we talk about the National Endowment for Democracy and organizations like that, these movements don't happen by themselves. But there's something happening to other students who are here from China, and that is every school has gotten notice to start scrutinizing and giving special scrutiny to all their students from China. That maybe they're stealing technology, stealing information, you know, even when it's just in theoretical courses. There are all sorts of Chinese scientists, even if they're U.S. citizens, who are suddenly facing real shutdown here. And we got to write and talk more about this. So it's like there's encouragement for one kind of movement here, and of course in Hong Kong, and a shutdown of another kind of movement. And it's done with police state tactics. It really is. And it doesn't happen in an accidental way. I was asked about health care. Now that, with over 70 years' time, it has changed almost every year and with each plan. One of the earliest campaigns was just called Away with All Pests, a campaign against rats and flies and just, you know, contamination. There were big national campaigns for immunization. There were big national campaigns in health, in exercise, in prenatal care, and in sort of every community organization following the health of the neighbors in your block, you know, so that people don't fall through the cracks. At this point, the life expectancy has improved dramatically, really on every level in China, from advanced technology and operations and whatnot, to even in the rural areas, health care, free accessible health care being provided. So But it's still a kind of a mixed bag depending on the area. And I should read up on this a lot more. But for the health standards, it's pretty advanced, certainly compared to anything else in other countries coming from where China was coming from. Just a point on what Michael had raised about the high level of security and carried out by so many young members of the communist youth. Now, the Hong Kong protests had declared again and again that they were going to disrupt the 70th anniversary events in China. And we know that in Hong Kong, more than half of the subway stations have been lit on fire. Now, that's a pretty scary thing to have happen when the entrance or right on the platform, people are setting fires. So what it meant throughout, they took security very seriously. Every subway entrance, it was like you went through a quick bag check, like you do an airport here. But it was run by sort of like young volunteers, but people took it very seriously. Even your water bottle, they checked because of the problems that were going on right then in Hong Kong with the gasoline bombs that were being set and the fires. But it was done in a way that kind of involved the whole population, and that is what makes a difference of where you feel absolutely preyed upon, scrutinized, and the role of the police here, and what happens when you kind of involve millions of people in it. And closing, I'll just say something on the Belt and Road, because you could almost, I think Omowale really said it the best in terms of in Africa, but it's true throughout Asia, throughout Latin America. China is previously a colonized country, a developing country, coming from an underdeveloped past. That's entirely different than an imperialist country that has gained its wealth by looting the world, from the slave trade to the destruction of indigenous people here. That's a whole different history. But there's the biggest difference is really, what does the U.S. have to sell around the world? It is the largest weapons dealer, and they sell military aid. And there are whole countries that are indebted because they had forced almost down their throat weapons sales. It's made for huge. Pakistan, just as an example, has ended up a completely impoverished, indebted country, has no water, dams, infrastructure in Pakistan, and yet mega millions have been spent on weapons. That's what the U.S. sells around the world. And what instead China is selling is a level of infrastructure development. And that's a very different thing, because it can really raise the level of the whole population, and it's of interest to a lot of countries. So I think that's the difference. They're not selling weapons actually in any of the countries. They are determined to defend themselves, but they're selling and building a lot of infrastructure that will increase trade. And it's a plan that's about 10 times the size of what was the Marshall Plan at the end of World War II. So it's a big infrastructure plan. Anyway, there's lots more to study and read and learn on all of this.